There is a document in front of you, perhaps the lease agreement you signed last year, folded up and forgotten, or the receipt you received this morning, sitting in a corner of your pocket. You simply look at it, and one mark puts you at ease, and simply one mark changes almost everything. You do not check. You do not engage your logic. You simply accept. As if trusting someone. You trust it, and everything falls back to normal. When did you learn to trust a face more than a mark? Because at some point you did. Everyone around you did too. And the story of how this happened is one of the oldest and most significant stories in the entire history of money. This did not begin with banks. It did not begin with coins, banknotes, or any of the instruments we associate with financial history. It began in ancient Mesopotamia, approximately 5,000 years ago, with a small, thumb-sized engraved object pressed into wet clay. The impression it left seemed simple. A pattern, a repeating figure, sometimes an arrangement made only of lines. But this simplicity was deceptive. Its meaning ran deep for people, both for the one who gave it and the one who received it. It meant that someone had confirmed this, a person who kept their identity within that mark, a person who could not easily deny what the mark said. In a world without photographs and standardized identity documents, to be able to say this about a piece of clay was a remarkable thing. In a practical sense, this was the beginning of portable accountability. Before this, creating trust between strangers was truly difficult. It had to be earned over time, through repeated communication, through the slow accumulation of shared experience that came only from actually knowing someone. You trusted the farmer you had been buying and selling grain with for decades. You trusted the merchant your father had vouched for. Trust was personal. It had boundaries, geography, memory, a connection to the people you would know over a lifetime. Trade advanced only as far as your personal network reached. Networks had limits. How far could goods travel? How complex could exchange become? Trust only worked at the personal level and could not be carried further without a new mechanism. The ancient world showed a great enthusiasm for trade, for metals, fabrics, grain, and spices that existed only in certain corners of the world. But the trust infrastructure could not keep pace with this enthusiasm. Something had to change. The cylinder seal was the answer that emerged, a small, engraved cylinder, typically made of stone or metal, carved with a design of unique character. When rolled across wet clay, it left a continuous impression, a visual signature that was almost impossible to replicate without the original object. Each seal was tied to a person, an office, an institution. Your seal on a clay tablet was legally you yourself. It carried your authorization to transactions you did not participate in. Across the distances, a contract required. A merchant in one city would press their seal onto a tablet and hand it to a courier, and a merchant 3 weeks away would receive it and proceed. Did they know them personally? No. Did they know who they were? No. But they trusted the mark. The mark carried authority, and almost everyone conducted their business this way, trusting a simple seal. Now your credibility could reach into rooms you had never entered. Your word could travel without your body. For a world trying to move beyond personal acquaintance, this was the first time accountability had been separated from physical presence. The earliest cylinder seals appeared around 3500 BCE and spread with remarkable speed throughout the ancient Near East. Because the problem they solved did not belong to just one culture. Every civilization, when attempting to conduct mass trade, ran into the same wall. The ancient Egyptians authenticated documents with scarab seals and indicated the ownership of goods. In the Indus Valley, merchants crafted extraordinarily complex seals. Though their full meaning remains unknown, their trade function was clear. In China, jade seals became symbols of authority. To possess the imperial seal meant the right to govern. Even as dynasties fell, the fate of the imperial seal was recorded with as much care as armies. The Romans continued this tradition through the signet ring, pressing their personal seals into hot wax to seal letters and authenticate contracts. When this practice passed into medieval Europe, it belonged to kings, popes, and nobles, as well as merchant guilds. The great documents of medieval financial history are, for the most part, sealed documents. Charters establishing property rights, letters of credit financing expeditions, debt instruments financing cathedrals. All of these drew their authority from a mark pressed into wax. Here something overlooked comes to light. The seal did not merely allow trust to reach further. It changed trust itself, slowly, invisibly. Before the seal, trust was bound to a person's character. To call someone trustworthy meant the proof of an inequality through behavior. Trust was an assessment of a person. After the seal, trust gradually became a property of systems. You trusted the mark. Through the mark, you trusted the institution behind it, and through the institution, you trusted rules and enforcement mechanisms that existed outside of any individual personality. This was more scalable, more transferable, less dependent on personal knowledge, but it also carried a vulnerability that the previous relational trust did not carry. Someone might not see that the reality behind a mark had crumbled while the mark continued to function. This vulnerability appeared almost as soon as the seal emerged. Ancient Mesopotamian legal codes contained specific penalties for seal theft, for stealing someone's cylinder and using it to forge contracts or falsify property claims. When trust was converted into a symbol, falsifying it became one of the most serious crimes. It did not merely harm one person, it also shook the system. Everyone trusted it, including those with no connection to the fraud. The tension between the technology of trust and the technology of breaking it has never been resolved. As the system has grown, become more interconnected, it has grown more complex. Medieval Europe contended with forged papal bulls and merchant seals capable of altering entire trade routes. Early modern states contended with the counterfeiting of banknotes, as people well understood how much these marks were worth in the world. The 20th century produced financial fraud on a scale the ancient world could not have imagined, not because human nature changed, but because systems grew so large that a single corrupted seal, at the center, could harm millions of people who had never heard the name of the institution that failed. The 2008 financial crisis was a seal problem in a very ancient sense. The instruments at its center carried the marks of credit rating agencies operating as containers of credibility, so that contracts could proceed between parties who had no ability to assess the underlying reality themselves. These agencies were, in the most genuine historical sense, seal makers. They pressed their marks onto financial products and presented them to a market that accepted them without verifying what the cylinder looked like or whose hands it had passed through. When seals lose their meaning, the system halts almost immediately, and throughout history, the consistency of the underlying pattern is striking. Each generation places new seals, adds new authorities, certifications, institutional validations, but each generation finds that the authority of the mechanisms fades and empties. In response, it builds better seals and more oversight, but each layer creates its own vulnerability and corruption, so the cycle does not end, because the problem it solves does not end. And ultimately, every system simply continues to carry the heavy burden of its own history. The need to conduct trustworthy transactions with strangers remains permanent. The need to fulfill promises that bind the future to the present remains permanent. The need to carry accountability across distances that personal relationships cannot cover remains permanent. These needs do not disappear. The seal was the first serious institutional response to this need. Imperfect from the beginning, vulnerable from the beginning, but still it worked well enough, across enough centuries and civilizations, to become the foundational logic of every financial system that followed. Every bond you purchase carries its echo. Every currency you use is sealed with it. Every contract you sign invokes it. The digital certificate that authenticates every website does the same thing in computer form, just as the clay impression did 5,000 years ago. It stands in for relational knowledge that does not exist. It affirms a reality that cannot be independently verified by the receiving party. It wishes to extend trust not to a person, but to a system. Most of the time it works this way. We live in a world filled with trusted seals. Seals confirmed by people we will never know, through the marks of institutions we will never verify. And we now trust the mark, not the person. What the ancient merchants created that is most remarkable is precisely this. Not merely that it endured, or that it spread to every civilization that engaged in trade, but that it became invisible. Trusting a mark instead of looking at a face became so natural that we stopped seeing it as a choice and forgot that this system was invented at a particular moment in history, created to solve a previously unsolved problem. We have inherited the solution so completely that we forgot there was ever a problem. And this forgetting allowed the seal to achieve something its inventors could never have anticipated. It blended into the background of everyday life. The next time you sign your name at the bottom of a page, confirm a screen with your finger to make a payment, or have a document notarized, you're standing at the end of a very long chain. You are extending a chain of accountability stretching across millennia, with a single sealed promise. From medieval Catholic archives to Roman signet rings to Egyptian scarabs, and to the river cities of ancient Mesopotamia. All the way back to a person you will never know, pressing an engraved stone into wet clay and handing it to a stranger, hoping that the mark would be enough, hoping that a symbol could carry the weight of a promise across distances a handshake could not reach. That person is long gone. The mark in some form is still here, and the hope that a system can hold what a relationship cannot has never gone away either. If you have ever signed a document without reading it fully, if you have trusted the mark more than the words, this shows how deeply the concept of accountability has been built into us. And if the seal was the moment when human trust was transferred to systems, do you think we have built these systems carefully enough to be worthy of that trust? If these questions make you think about the invisible mechanism behind financial history, about the architecture of how trust has functioned across time, this channel is dedicated precisely to that. Subscribe, and every week we will explore more deeply the stories that shaped the world you live in today. And if there is a moment in financial history that has always interested you, share it in the comments. The next video can continue from exactly where your question begins.